September, year 1940, northern Norway. The wind screamed across a fjord as icy spray froze instantly on steel decks. In the dim Arctic dawn, soldiers shivered beneath layers of wool, their rifles clutched tight but useless against the invisible enemy that seeped into their bones. Here, frostbite claimed more lives than bullets, and the sound of cracking ice could spell doom for a convoy or a battalion. The war in the Arctic was not only a clash of armies, it was a confrontation with nature itself, a battlefield where the snow buried both the living and the dead without distinction. The world remembers Stalingrad, El Alamein, Normandy. Few recall the forgotten front where the circle of fire met the circle of ice, a place where nights stretched into endless darkness, where storms devoured ships, and where soldiers discovered that courage meant surviving another hour in a frozen hell. This is the story of the Arctic war battles few speak of, yet as brutal and decisive as any fought in the Second World War. The Arctic front lines introduced horrors, unlike any seen in Europe's more familiar battlegrounds. Soldiers who had endured machine gun fire and artillery barrages found themselves unprepared for the relentless hand of the cold. Temperatures plummeted far below zero, and the wind scoured the land with such force that exposed flesh could blacken in minutes. More than once, patrols vanished into whiteouts, so dense that men walked in circles until exhaustion froze them where they stood. In this frozen hell, survival became a weapon, and the simplest task, loading a rifle, lighting a stove, even speaking, turned into a battle against the elements. Geography itself was an enemy. Norway's jagged fjords cut like knives into the coastline, creating narrow corridors where ships and submarines hunted each other under constant threat of storms. Finland's endless forests gave way to tundra, where no shelter existed except snow caves dug by desperate men. The Arctic Ocean carried ice floes that could smash a hull as easily as depth charges. For soldiers and sailors alike, the front was less about advancing and more about clinging to life in landscapes that refused to be conquered. Technology offered little comfort. Lubricants froze, fuel turned to sludge, and radio batteries died within hours. German and Soviet tank crews learned that engines often failed to start unless fires were lit beneath the hulls. Aircraft could barely operate, wings iced over, propellers locked, and landing strips vanished under snowdrifts overnight. Even when machines worked, they betrayed their operators with terrifying suddenness. A truck might run for miles before collapsing into silence in the middle of a blizzard, stranding its crew to a fate more cruel than enemy fire. The human toll was staggering. Frostbite amputations filled field hospitals, while pneumonia and trench foot claimed more soldiers than direct combat. Diaries recovered from both German and Soviet units describe men weeping quietly as their fingers blackened, not from weakness, but from knowing they would never again hold a weapon or write a letter home. Medical officers rationed scarce supplies of morphine, saving them not for the wounded, but for the frostbitten, whose agony was considered worse. Death here was often silent, a gradual slipping away as exhaustion, hunger, and cold conspired against the will to live. Yet amidst the misery, the frozen front shaped unique warriors. Finnish ski troops glided across snowfields with ghostly speed, striking Soviet columns before vanishing into forests. Soviet naval crews braved Arctic convoys that few believed could succeed, steering ships through storms so violent that waves swallowed destroyers whole. German Gebirgsjäger, trained in mountain warfare, adapted to the tundra with brutal efficiency, learning to fight in terrain where tanks and trucks became useless. Each side forged a new type of soldier, not defined by weapons, but by endurance. In the end, what made the Arctic War distinct was not just the scale of suffering, but its invisibility. Unlike Stalingrad's rubble or Normandy's beaches, the Arctic left behind few monuments. Snow buried trenches within days, Storms erased shipwrecks from the sea, and the silence of the wilderness swallowed memories whole. This was a battlefield where victory meant surviving until dawn, and where defeat was often marked only by the stillness of frozen forms lying beneath a blanket of white. In the spring of the year 1940, the small Norwegian town of Narvik became the focus of global attention. Its icy harbor, nestled deep within fjords, held value far beyond its modest size. Narvik was the lifeline for Swedish iron ore, the mineral that fed Germany's war machine. As long as the ore flowed, German tanks and planes would continue rolling off assembly lines. For Britain and France, stopping that flow meant strangling the enemy at its heart. For Germany, securing Narvik was nothing less than survival. The invasion of Norway in April brought this remote town into the storm. German destroyers entered the fjord under cover of darkness, landing troops while fierce naval battles erupted across the frigid waters. Snow still covered the mountains, forcing soldiers to fight in conditions where skis mattered more than rifles. Norwegian defenders, joined later by British, French, and even Polish troops, fought stubbornly against elite German Gebirgsjäger, who had trained for such frozen terrain. What followed was a brutal struggle of ambushes on snow-covered ridges, firefights fought in blizzards, and naval clashes where ships fired blindly through fog. The sea battles of Narvik remain among the most intense of the Arctic War. British destroyers slipped into the fjord, their guns blazing at point-blank range against German vessels trapped by geography. Torpedoes exploded beneath the surface, shaking mountainsides with thunder that echoed across the town. Civilians hid in basements as warships burned in the harbor, their steel twisted and their crews leaping into icy waters where death came within minutes. By the end of May, almost every German destroyer committed to Narvik lay at the bottom of the fjords, a catastrophic loss for the Kriegsmarine. On land, the Allies briefly gained the upper hand. French Foreign Legion units stormed snowy ridges with bayonets fixed, while Polish troops advanced under relentless machine gun fire. Norwegian civilians, caught in the chaos, guided Allied soldiers through mountain passes and carried supplies on sleds. Yet even with tactical victories, strategy betrayed the defenders. With the fall of France looming, Allied forces withdrew, leaving Norway to German occupation. Narvik was retaken by the Wehrmacht, but at enormous cost. The destruction of Germany's destroyer fleet limited its naval power for the rest of the war. Narvik revealed the paradox of Arctic warfare. Control of a tiny town in the frozen north dictated the flow of resources that sustained an empire. The battle also exposed the unique brutality of war above the Arctic Circle, where men froze to death beside burning ships, and where survival depended as much on snowshoes and sleds as on rifles and cannons. The gateway to the north had been stained with blood, setting the tone for years of forgotten battles to come. Months before Narvik erupted, Finland had already shown the world the unforgiving nature of Arctic conflict. In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion, expecting to crush Finland within weeks. What followed instead was a stunning display of defiance, as poorly equipped Finnish forces turned the frozen forests into deadly traps. This was the Winter War, a campaign that redefined how men could fight in sub-zero conditions. The Red Army advanced with overwhelming numbers, tanks rumbling through snowdrifts, and columns of infantry stretching for miles. But Soviet soldiers, many from southern regions unprepared for the cold, wore thin coats and struggled in temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Their supply lines faltered, their equipment froze, and their discipline crumbled under the weight of snow and hunger. Against this mass stood Finnish ski troops, lightly armed but perfectly adapted to the terrain. They struck like shadows, gliding silently through forests, launching sudden ambushes, then vanishing into the snow. One tactic became legendary: the Matti. Finnish fighters would cut Soviet columns into isolated pockets, surrounding them in the wilderness. Trapped units, unable to maneuver heavy tanks in deep snow, became easy prey for Molotov cocktails, grenades, and rifles fired from hidden positions. Entire Soviet divisions were immobilized and destroyed this way, their burned-out tanks still visible today as rusting monuments to folly. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers, freezing in darkness, hunted by unseen enemies whose skis carried them faster than boots could march. Amid this, one figure rose into legend: Simo Heiha, the White Death, a humble farmer turned sniper. He camouflaged himself in white and used nothing but a simple rifle without a scope. From the forests of Karelia, he eliminated hundreds of Soviet soldiers, becoming a ghost-like terror whispered among the invaders. His deeds symbolized Finland's resilience: ordinary men using ingenuity and the environment itself, defying a superpower through sheer will. Though Finland eventually signed peace after months of brutal fighting, the Winter War revealed the shocking limits of Soviet power and the extreme demands of Arctic combat. It showed the world that in this frozen theater, numbers meant little if men could not endure the cold. The gamble of Finland's resistance reshaped strategies for years to come, teaching every army that the Arctic would never bow to sheer force. It demanded adaptation, courage, and sacrifice unlike any other battlefield. Far above the Arctic Circle, the Soviet port of Murmansk became one of the most vital arteries of the Second World War. Surrounded by barren tundra and frozen seas, it might have seemed an unlikely hub for the survival of a nation. Yet through this gateway flowed weapons, fuel, and food delivered by the Allies under the Lend-Lease program. Without Murmansk, the Soviet Union's ability to resist the German invasion would have been crippled. The battle for this lifeline was not only fought with bombs and bullets, it was fought against ice, storms, and the endless darkness of the polar night. Convoys of merchant ships braved voyages from Britain and America to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, escorted by destroyers and cruisers through seas ruled by German submarines and aircraft. The sailors called these routes the suicide missions of the Arctic. Freezing spray turned decks into skating rinks. Men slipped overboard and vanished in seconds, and constant air attacks tested nerves already strained by the cold. The convoys lost ships to torpedoes and bombs, but many more were battered into submission by storms that towered higher than any wave seen in the Atlantic. To those aboard, nature often seemed as determined as the enemy to destroy them. The Germans recognized Murmansk's importance and launched relentless efforts to sever the lifeline. Bombing raids scorched the port, while U-boats prowled the Barents Sea, waiting for convoys that had nowhere to hide on the open expanse of Arctic water. Yet despite staggering losses, the convoys endured. Stories abound of ships limping into harbor half destroyed, their crews frostbitten and starved, yet their cargo intact. Every tank, every truck, every ton of fuel unloaded in Murmansk meant Soviet divisions could continue fighting hundreds of miles to the south. Life in Murmansk itself was a trial of endurance. The city endured some of the heaviest bombing outside Germany, yet its people refused to abandon their homes. Civilians dug shelters into frozen ground. Children carried buckets of water through rubble, and factories kept producing war material under blackout conditions. All the while, Soviet soldiers stood guard in trenches cut into permafrost, defending the approaches against German and Finnish offensives. In this place, the line between civilian and soldier blurred, for survival itself was resistance. Murmansk's survival became a symbol of Allied determination and Soviet resilience. By the war's end, millions of tons of supplies had passed through its battered docks. It remained the port that refused to fall, a frozen gateway that helped turn the tide against Germany. And for the men who sailed the Arctic convoys, Murmansk was not just a destination. It was proof that courage could endure in even the coldest corner of the earth. In the summer of 1941, as German armies swept deep into the Soviet Union, Hitler ordered a bold plan for the Arctic. Operation Silver Fox aimed to cut off the Murmansk lifeline by seizing the port and choking the Soviet North into submission. The offensive combined German mountain troops, Finnish divisions, and Luftwaffe support, all tasked with crushing the Arctic bastion. On paper, the plan promised swift victory. In reality, it became a nightmare of frozen mud, endless daylight, and stubborn defenders who refused to break. The German Gebirgsjäger, elite mountain soldiers, advanced across the tundra with confidence born of training in the Alps. Yet the Arctic was no mountain range. It was a wasteland of bogs, rivers, and endless scrub that swallowed vehicles and exhausted men. Supply lines stretched thin, rations froze solid, and swarms of mosquitoes tormented soldiers during the brief summer. The very land itself seemed to resist the invaders. For every mile gained, exhaustion claimed dozens, and for every village captured, the Red Army counterattacked with ferocity. Finnish troops, motivated by their earlier struggle against the Soviets, pressed forward with grim determination. Yet even they, masters of Arctic warfare, found the terrain unforgiving. Rivers became death traps, with men drowning under heavy packs, and forests provided cover for Soviet partisans who struck supply lines with deadly precision. The promised rapid advance slowed to a crawl, and the dream of cutting Murmansk off began to fade into frustration. The Soviets, fighting for survival, transformed the Arctic wilderness into a fortress. Trenches dug into frozen earth resisted bombardment, while reinforcements arrived by rail, despite constant German air raids. Soviet pilots, flying outdated aircraft, used the long daylight hours of summer to launch relentless sorties. And as winter returned, the balance shifted entirely. German troops, still exposed on open tundra, faced the same cruel cold that had devastated Napoleon's armies a century earlier. Frostbite and hunger eroded morale faster than bullets. Operation Silver Fox ultimately collapsed, leaving Murmansk in Soviet hands and the Arctic lifeline intact. The failure marked one of the most decisive defeats for Germany's northern strategy. Instead of strangling the Soviet North, the Germans became bogged down in a theater that drained resources and offered little gain. The frozen wilderness had chewed up elite divisions and left them shattered. It was proof that in the Arctic, even the most ambitious plans could dissolve into futility, swallowed by snow, ice, and the sheer will of defenders who refused to yield. The Arctic seas became an arena where steel and ice collided in duels few recall today. Far from the grand fleets of the Atlantic and Pacific, destroyers, cruisers, and submarines fought desperate battles in waters so cold that a man overboard survived mere minutes. These were clashes fought not only against the enemy, but also against waves higher than houses and gales that shattered masts. Victory here meant outlasting both nature and the enemy. German U-boats prowled beneath the black water, hunting the convoys bound for Murmansk. They lurked beneath floes of drifting ice, listening for the propellers of merchant ships. When they struck, torpedoes ripped open hulls and sent men scrambling into lifeboats that froze solid before rescue arrived. Above the surface, Allied destroyers scoured the seas, dropping depth charges that thundered through the water, shaking the icebergs that dotted the horizon. In these duels, silence and patience often mattered more than firepower. The surface battles were no less brutal. On more than one occasion, German heavy cruisers like the Admiral Hipper ambushed convoys, their guns lighting up the Arctic night. Allied escorts, outgunned but determined, hurled themselves into the fight, drawing fire to shield the merchant ships. In one such engagement, British destroyers charged against impossible odds, their decks slick with ice, their crews fighting until their ships slipped beneath the waves. The courage of those men bought time for the convoys to scatter, ensuring that supplies still reached Soviet shores. Even the weather became a weapon. Storms masked movements, scattering convoys or hiding ambushes in walls of snow. Fog settled so thick that captains navigated by instinct, knowing a wrong turn could send their ship crashing into an iceberg or straight into the path of enemy guns. More than once, battles ended not with a decisive strike, but with both sides retreating, battered and half destroyed by the fury of the Arctic itself. For sailors, these duels were etched not in glory, but in survival. Diaries describe hands frozen to metal rails, eyes bloodshot from days without sleep, and the eerie silence after a storm when the sea was littered with wreckage and corpses. The Arctic naval war may not have produced grand victories, but its cost in lives and ships was immense. It was a front where courage meant facing not just the enemy's guns, but the unforgiving wrath of the northern seas. In the remote Arctic north of Finland lay Petsamo, a region rich in nickel, a metal essential for producing weapons and armor. Control of this frozen land meant control of one of the war's most strategic resources. From the very start, Petsamo became a prize, fought over by Germans, Soviets, and Finns, each willing to spill blood in the snow for its mines. Here, the battles were small in scale, but enormous in consequence, shaping the availability of raw materials for entire armies. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, Petsamo became a crucial staging ground. German troops, working with Finnish allies, fortified the area and secured access to the mines. For Berlin, nickel was no less important than oil. It hardened steel, made tanks more durable, and strengthened the Luftwaffe's aircraft. To lose Petsamo would have meant weakening the entire German war machine. The Soviets understood this and struck repeatedly. Red Army divisions advanced through forests and tundra, clashing with German and Finnish defenders in firefights that often resembled skirmishes more than full battles. Yet every engagement carried heavy costs, for the Arctic terrain offered no shelter. Soldiers crawled through snowdrifts under machine gun fire, while artillery shells buried themselves harmlessly in the frozen earth before detonating. In these conditions, even a single hill or bridge became an objective worth dying for. Local Sami populations found themselves trapped between armies. Some guided Soviet patrols across reindeer trails. Others carried supplies for Finnish units. The land itself, with its endless forests and frozen lakes, shaped the outcome as much as weapons did. Blizzards halted offensives, avalanches buried entire companies, and the long polar nights turned camps into frozen prisons, where morale withered as quickly as exposed flesh. By the war's final year, Petsamo's fate was sealed. Soviet offensives overwhelmed German positions, forcing a retreat that abandoned both mines and fortifications. For Berlin, it was a crippling blow to its already collapsing industry. For the Soviets, the victory secured vital resources and symbolized resilience in the harshest battlefield on Earth. Petsamo, though small on a map, demonstrated how in the Arctic, every inch of frozen ground carried weight far beyond its size, an unforgiving lesson written in blood and ice. The Lend-Lease program became one of the great lifelines of the Second World War, and nowhere did it face greater challenges than in the Arctic. American and British supplies had to cross oceans whipped by storms and stalked by German submarines to reach Soviet ports. Trucks, aircraft, canned food, fuel, and ammunition, all critical for the Soviet war effort, moved through routes that seemed impossible. And yet, against all odds, they arrived. Convoys left from ports in Scotland, Iceland, and even as far as North America, braving waters where the cold could kill a man faster than any bullet. Ships plowed through seas, covered in shifting ice, their decks coated in frozen spray that added tons of weight and threatened to capsize them. The sailors endured days of endless daylight in summer and eternal darkness in winter, each carrying its own terror air raids under the midnight sun or submarine attacks hidden in blackness. Each convoy was a gamble with death, and yet they continued, driven by the knowledge that millions of Soviet soldiers depended on their cargo. The material delivered changed the face of the war. American trucks carried Soviet infantry across vast distances, helping them outrun retreating Germans. Packaged food kept entire divisions alive during brutal winters when Soviet rations dwindled to crumbs. Even aircraft arrived by way of Arctic skies, flown over Alaska and Siberia by brave pilots who crossed storms, mountains, and endless tundra to deliver warplanes into Soviet hands. This cooperation, born of necessity, forged a bond that helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. German attempts to stop these lifelines were relentless. The Luftwaffe sent bombers to strike ports, while U-boats lay in wait on convoy routes. Entire convoys were sometimes decimated, ships burning on the horizon, while survivors clung to wreckage in seas that gave them minutes to live. Still, no matter how many ships were lost, more followed. The Allies accepted terrible casualties because they understood that Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were more than ports. They were the arteries that kept the Soviet heart beating. The story of Lend-Lease in the Arctic is not only one of logistics, but of sheer determination. Every ship that sailed carried not just supplies but also hope, a promise that the frozen front would not be abandoned. The convoys stand as monuments to courage, to men who fought storms and submarines alike to deliver lifelines into the very jaws of war. If the battles of the Arctic were brutal, the daily life of soldiers stationed there was even more relentless. Unlike other fronts, where trenches or villages offered some semblance of shelter, here men lived exposed to conditions that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The cold gnawed at them day and night, a constant presence more feared than enemy fire. Shelters were dug into permafrost, walls lined with snow blocks to trap heat from meager stoves. Frost crept across every surface, turning rifles into frozen clubs unless warmed by body heat. Meals consisted of thin soups and bread so hard it had to be thawed before eating. Water came from melting snow, often tainted by smoke or dirt. Soldiers learned to wrap their feet in layers of cloth, yet frostbite still claimed toes, feet, and entire limbs. In this front, survival depended as much on improvisation as on discipline. Morale was tested by the endless monotony of white landscapes and long stretches of polar night. Days passed without sunlight, broken only by the flicker of lamps or the distant glow of artillery fire. Letters from home arrived rarely, and men often turned to carving wood, writing diaries, or singing songs to keep despair at bay. German, Soviet, and Finnish soldiers alike recorded the same haunting truth. The cold felt like an invisible enemy, one that could not be shot or outflanked. Small comforts mattered enormously. A cigarette shared, a pot of hot coffee, or the sound of a familiar tune played on a harmonica could revive spirits more than any speech. Even enemies occasionally found common humanity in this frozen wilderness. Accounts exist of soldiers leaving food for starving locals, or exchanging nods of silent recognition across no man's land. Bound not by politics, but by the shared struggle against the elements. Life on the frozen front was a paradox. Men faced constant danger, yet victories and defeats seemed dwarfed by the immensity of nature. Unlike other theaters of war, where destruction was visible in ruins and craters, here the snow buried everything: the dead, the trenches, even the memories. For many who fought in the Arctic, the greatest battle was not with rifles or artillery, but with the merciless hand of winter that never loosened its grip. After years of holding positions in Norway and Finland, the Wehrmacht faced a new reality. The Soviet advance from the east and the growing Allied control of the seas made their Arctic strongholds untenable. What had once been fortified, bases bristling with heavy guns, supply depots, and U-boat pens, were now liabilities, vulnerable to isolation and eventual destruction. The retreat was unlike any other. German forces withdrew not through rolling fields or ruined towns, but across landscapes of ice, tundra, and fjords. Entire units were forced to march through snowstorms, with dwindling supplies, abandoning heavy equipment they could no longer move. Horses died in the cold. Vehicles froze where they stood, and soldiers burned furniture, doors, even wooden rifle stocks, just to create fire for a few hours of warmth. The Arctic itself seemed to conspire against them, turning every step of retreat into torment. Operation Nordlicht, the planned withdrawal from northern Finland and Norway, aimed to salvage German divisions before they were cut off. The retreat involved scorched earth tactics. Villages were torched, bridges blown, and infrastructure destroyed to slow the Soviet pursuit. The result was a trail of devastation across Lapland. Civilians watched helplessly as their homes burned, forced into makeshift shelters, or left to wander through snowbound forests in search of food and safety. For many Finns and Norwegians, the German retreat meant suffering almost as severe as occupation itself. Despite careful planning, the retreat was chaotic. Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, pushing through frozen rivers and across mountain passes. German units that had once boasted superior mobility now found themselves immobilized, trapped by the very terrain they had occupied for years. Desperate to avoid encirclement, they fought rearguard actions in valleys and on icy ridges, where visibility was measured in meters and the ground froze solid beneath fallen men. Casualties mounted not from bullets alone, but from exhaustion, frostbite, and starvation. The German Arctic retreat left scars that endured long after the war. Entire towns in Lapland were reduced to ashes. Roads and bridges painstakingly built during the occupation lay in ruins. For the soldiers who survived, the memory of those final months was defined not by glorious battles, but by an endless march through ice and fire. It was a retreat where the elements delivered the final blow, stripping away the last illusions of control and leaving only the brutal truth. In the Arctic, even armies could vanish into the snow. Amid the clash of armies and the thunder of naval guns, another force moved quietly across the frozen landscapes, the resistance. In Norway, Finland, and the northern reaches of the Soviet Union, local partisans and underground networks waged a war of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and survival. Their battleground was not just against German troops, but against the unforgiving climate that tested every act of defiance. Norwegian resistance fighters operated deep within fjords and mountain passes, guiding Allied submarines into hidden inlets or relaying weather reports that proved critical for Arctic convoy operations. With radios concealed in fishing huts and codes hidden in ordinary letters, they supplied intelligence that could mean the difference between a safe convoy and a massacre. Many were captured and executed, but others slipped through patrols like shadows across the snow, sustained by local villagers who risked everything to hide them. In Finland, the resistance was more complex, shaped by the nation's shifting alliances. While some groups fought directly against German occupation during the retreat, others struggled under Soviet pressure. The chaos created opportunities for small bands of partisans to strike German supply lines, blow up railway tracks, and cut communications. Their actions, though small in scale compared to battles at the front, created constant unease, forcing German units to divert troops to guard against an enemy they could rarely see. Perhaps most striking were the Soviet partisans operating in the Kola Peninsula and northern Karelia. They lived in forests where temperatures plunged well below freezing, raiding German camps and disrupting logistics despite lacking proper equipment. German reports describe the frustration of fighting an enemy that could appear in silence, strike, and disappear into the white void. For these partisans, survival was victory, and each act of sabotage was a reminder that the frozen front was never fully under German control. The Arctic resistance may not have delivered decisive victories, but their contributions were vital threads in the fabric of war. They sustained hope in occupied lands, provided intelligence to allies, and made the occupation more costly for the Germans. Above all, they embodied resilience. Ordinary men and women who defied not only one of the most powerful armies in history, but also the merciless hand of nature. Their names are less known, their battles often unrecorded, yet their courage was carved into the ice and stone of the far north, where memory lingers like footprints in snow. In the vast emptiness of the Arctic, small groups of partisans became the most elusive enemies the Germans ever faced. These were not regular soldiers but farmers, fishermen, reindeer herders, and students who refused to accept occupation. Their strength lay not in numbers but in knowledge of the land. They could vanish into a snowstorm, move across frozen lakes without leaving traces, and strike at isolated German outposts where no regular army dared to go. The Wehrmacht's records often describe them with a mix of frustration and fear, calling them ghosts of the tundra. Supplied by Allied submarines and aircraft, the partisans carried weapons, radios, and explosives hidden in remote valleys. Their missions were daring, cutting railway lines that carried German supplies to the northern ports, guiding Soviet units through treacherous mountain passes, and marking targets for Allied bombers. Each success was measured not only in destroyed material, but also in the psychological toll it took on German soldiers who never felt safe, even deep behind their own lines. Winter provided the partisans both shelter and danger. They built snow caves known as convoys that insulated them from the freezing winds, but survival inside demanded discipline. Fires were rare for fear of detection, so they endured long nights in darkness. Hunger was constant, relieved only when sympathetic villagers risked everything to share food. For civilians caught between German occupation and partisan support, the cost of resistance was brutal: reprisals, burned homes, and executions. Yet many still chose to help. One of the most remarkable operations was the Norwegian heavy water sabotage at Vemork, south of the Arctic Circle. But its spirit echoed in the far north. In Finnmark and Troms, Smaller sabotage missions crippled German communications and slowed their retreat. German reports complained of telephone lines being cut nightly and fuel depots mysteriously exploding. To the occupiers, these were acts of terrorism. To the locals, they were acts of survival and patriotism. The Germans tried to crush partisan movements with patrols, sweeps, and brutal retaliation, yet the terrain itself betrayed them. Heavy vehicles bogged down in snow, dogs and skis left obvious trails, and partisans always had the advantage of surprise. German commanders eventually admitted that partisans forced them to divert entire battalions to guard duties, weakening their front lines. What seemed a small nuisance became a strategic drain. For the people of the Arctic, the partisans symbolized the will to resist even in the harshest environment. Their struggle was often invisible to the wider world, overshadowed by grand battles elsewhere. Yet in the silence of frozen forests and under the northern lights, these irregular fighters shaped the course of the war by proving that no occupation could ever be complete. No campaign in the Arctic could exist without the lifeline of convoys that connected the Western Allies to the Soviet Union. These voyages through the Barents Sea were among the most dangerous of the entire war. Men on deck felt both the sting of icy winds and the constant threat of attack. German U-boats lurked beneath the waves. Luftwaffe bombers circled from bases in Norway. And surface raiders like the battleship Tirpitz threatened to annihilate entire fleets. Yet often, the weather was the deadliest enemy of all. Storms rolled in with terrifying speed, turning calm seas into walls of water. Ships coated in ice grew top-heavy, capsizing without warning. Crews risked their lives with sledgehammers and axes to break the ice before it dragged their vessels under. Frostbitten hands bled as men clung to ropes, stiff with frozen salt. Those who fell overboard had only minutes before hypothermia ended their lives. In such conditions, survival was as uncertain as victory. Despite the horror, the convoys pressed on. The cargo they carried, tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and food was the difference between Soviet survival and collapse. Each vessel represented thousands of soldiers who could continue fighting on the Eastern Front. When a convoy arrived safely at Murmansk or Archangel, it was celebrated like a miracle. When one was lost, the pain was shared across nations. Families in Britain, America, and Canada mourned sons who had sailed into frozen seas and never returned. Convoy PQ-17 became infamous when heavy losses shattered morale. German attacks scattered the formation, and dozens of ships were sunk. Survivors described watching comrades burn in oil-slicked waters or vanish into the fog. Yet even after such tragedies, new convoys sailed again. The courage required was not in facing one battle, but in knowing that each voyage meant reliving the same terror, again and again. With no guarantee of return, sailors found small ways to fight despair. Some painted lucky symbols on the bows of their ships. Others carried charms from home. A favorite song played on harmonicas or gramophones could lift spirits for a night, even as the Arctic wind howled outside. Letters from home, delayed for months, became treasures read and reread until the paper tore. In such fragile comforts lay the strength to endure. The gamble of the convoys was that every ship, every man, and every piece of cargo was expendable, yet indispensable. Without them, the Soviet Union might have collapsed. With them, the Eastern Front could continue grinding down the Wehrmacht. Their sacrifices, often overlooked, formed one of the most decisive lifelines of the entire war. The Arctic War forced armies to innovate in ways they had never imagined. Traditional uniforms and equipment were death sentences in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The Soviets issued felt boots known as valenki and heavy fur coats, while the Germans experimented with layered clothing and insulated tents. Allied convoys carried entire shipments of parkas, gloves, and heaters designed specifically for northern operations. The cold demanded a new science of survival. Vehicles presented another challenge. Engines refused to start in freezing nights. Oil congealed, and metal snapped under sudden stress. Mechanics learned to light small fires under tanks to warm engines before battle. Aircraft required de-icing fluids and constant maintenance to fly safely. Fuel additives were invented to keep gasoline liquid at impossible temperatures. These improvisations, tested in the Arctic, later influenced cold weather technology worldwide. Medical science advanced as well. Doctors documented thousands of cases of frostbite, trench foot, and malnutrition. New treatments were developed for rewarming tissue without causing further damage. And surgical techniques adapted to field hospitals operating in freezing tents. Many discoveries in frostbite treatment made during the Arctic campaigns are still used by military and civilian medicine today. Navigation required innovation too. Compasses faltered near the magnetic pole, and maps often proved useless in featureless tundra. Pilots and sailors relied on celestial navigation when skies were clear, or on landmarks barely visible through snow. Radar, still a new technology, was tested and refined in Arctic waters, providing crucial advantages against U-boats and aircraft. The Arctic, with its extremes, became a proving ground for technologies that would later spread across the globe. Even the humble food ration had to be redesigned. Traditional canned meals froze solid, so armies experimented with high-calorie compressed foods that could be thawed quickly. Chocolate, dried meat, and concentrated soups became essentials. The concept of calorie-dense survival rations emerged directly from these campaigns, a practice still present in modern militaries. Science at the edge of survival revealed a truth as important as any battle. Victory in the Arctic was not won by brute force alone, but by adapting to an environment that punished every mistake. Innovation was not optional. It was the difference between life and death. The war in the Arctic ended not with parades or triumphant declarations, but with silence. As German forces withdrew and the front lines dissolved, the frozen landscapes swallowed the scars of battle. Yet the legacy of those years remained etched into the memory of nations. For the Soviets, the Arctic campaign symbolized endurance proof that even in the most hostile environment, their armies could advance and overcome. For Norwegians and Finns, it marked both suffering and survival, a reminder of how their homelands had been turned into battlefields, where entire communities paid the price of occupation and retreat. Strategically, the Arctic proved its worth. The convoys that braved the northern seas had delivered the supplies that kept the Soviet war machine alive, directly shaping the outcome of the Eastern Front. Without the oil, vehicles, and weapons transported through frozen waters, the Soviet advance might have stalled, altering the balance of the war. At the same time, German attempts to control the Arctic exposed the limitations of their doctrine. Their tanks and fortresses, designed for European plains, were rendered useless in blizzards, marshes, and ice. Environmentally, the Arctic battles revealed truths about warfare that still resonate today. Nature was not a neutral backdrop, but an active force that shaped tactics, strategy, and survival. The frozen front taught armies that technology and training were powerless without preparation for the environment itself. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion killed as many men as bullets and shells. This was a war where nature fought alongside both sides, claiming lives indiscriminately. The human cost lingered long after the guns fell silent. Lapland's villages had been burned to ash, families displaced into the wilderness, and generations scarred by memories of endless winters, filled with fire and fear. For veterans, the Arctic campaign became a story rarely told, overshadowed by Normandy, Stalingrad, and the Pacific Islands. Yet for those who endured it, the Arctic was unforgettable, a place where war stripped men to their limits and tested what survival truly meant. In the decades that followed, memorials in Norway, Finland, and Russia began to acknowledge these forgotten battles. Local museums preserve artifacts, rusted skis once used by partisans, shattered helmets found in tundra marshes, and photographs of convoys cutting through seas of ice. Slowly, the frozen front is being remembered, not just as a theater of war, but as a lesson in human resilience and the costs of survival, where nature itself was the most ruthless adversary. The Arctic front of the Second World War remains one of history's most haunting silences. It was a war where men learned that their greatest enemy was not always the soldier opposite them, but the snow that froze their lungs, the darkness that lasted for months, and the storms that swallowed ships whole. It was a war fought in landscapes where maps became meaningless, and survival was a victory in itself. The legacy of these frozen battles lies in their paradox. Though overshadowed by larger campaigns, they shaped the war's outcome in quiet but decisive ways. Convoys that braved the Arctic ensured the survival of the Soviet Union, and resistance in remote villages proved that even the most isolated communities could defy tyranny. These stories remind us that the war was global, not only in geography, but in human experience, reaching even the coldest corners of the earth. To remember, the Arctic War is to honor not just armies and strategies, but the endurance of ordinary men and women. It is to see beyond medals and statistics, to the frozen trenches, the burning villages, and the convoys that crossed seas of fire and ice. The frozen front lines may have been forgotten by many, but for those who walked them, the memory never melted. And now, it is your turn to keep these stories alive. If this journey through the forgotten Arctic front moved you, give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this frozen war surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, where history's hidden battles are brought back from the silence. Together, we can ensure that even the wars fought in ice and shadow are never forgotten.